and welcome to Blockchain Gaming World, episode 99. I'm your host, Jon Jordan, and I'm very pleased that joining me this week is Joost van Dunen. How's it going, Joost?
Pretty good. How are you? Good to see you. Good.
Yes, and this is not just because we're on number 99. I think this is the first podcast I've sort of done with someone who I guess, or we'll find out if you are, is maybe not a sort of a sort of blockchain true believer. So I think we've got up to number 98 with a lot of people who are really into blockchain and building stuff. And I think now, blockchain gaming is now sort of broadening out, and we're starting to get some people who are sort of approaching it from a different angle. So I think, you'll explain what you've been up to, Juiced, over the years, but coming at it from a games perspective, and I think that's going to be interesting for sort of dialogue and interesting for broadening out what blockchain games are. Because I think at the moment we've been pretty focused on the blockchain side of things, probably less on the game side. So hopefully for people who are interested in the podcast, over the coming next 100 or 99, I'll be talking to a wider range of people rather than just the people building blockchain stuff. So I think that's sort of useful from an education point of view. But I'll give my quick introduction to Juiced, and then he can give his. So I've been pretty interested because Juiced obviously has a very sort of analytical mind, and he's been involved with sort of game data and market data, and he writes a great Substack called SuperJoost. And because I was been subscribed to that, and I've noticed over the last sort of few months you've been writing more and more about blockchain in that, which is sort of why I reached out to you, because I thought that you had a good perspective. So yeah, that's my introduction to you. Do you want to give a potted history to what you do, what you have done?
Thank you, John. And of course, always a pleasure to talk. I've been following your work as well, and you bring a unique edge to the conversation, so I appreciate that. So I've been in gaming and the research of gaming for about 20 years now. I started off as sort of this academic project. So I did a PhD on video games as sort of as a center of an intersection between society and technology. Like, how do people make games? Like, what happens when you get fans and modders to create things? And if you could make anything, what do they make, right? And so that was an academic question for myself. And to pay for all this fancy American education, as a Dutchman coming into the country here, it was really interesting for me to kind of explored also from a commercial side. So I ended up sort of as a gunslinger analyst for a few different companies, a few different consultancies. And, they were always looking at games sort of as a sideshow, and that was wonderful. Until, I guess, really 2008, 2009, when it started to occur to me that digitalization would be a big deal, right? So the mobile phone started to change, the smartphone had released, but we'd also saw the introduction of a lot of like free-to-play mechanics and browser-based games and all of this. And so that, in my mind at the time, was going to be a seismic shift, if nothing else for the fact that you'd have to track the data behind it. And so we started a company called SuperData in 2010-ish. And it ended up being a couple of years for us to kind of solidify the data set to speak in a meaningful way to the market, saying, okay, well, how much do we think League of Legends generates? How much does any of this make? And it's, at the end of the day, it took us about 3 years to get it off the ground, and we started hiring. In 2017, we raised a round and then sold it to Nielsen in 2018, sort of put the small fry on the big stage. And that was an interesting trajectory too, because it's very different to, if you're slinging data, commercially, it's a very different perspective than as an academic. So that's the second hat I've been wearing over the last couple of years. And then in addition to all this, is like I've kept one foot or one toe in the university by way of teaching at the business school here at NYU. And that's been a lot of fun, just kind of dealing with, undergraduates. I have a class of 60 of them. It's between the business school and the NYU Game Center. And so I sit sort of in between that nexus of, how do you make amazing things and still feed yourself kind of thing. That's sort of the fundamental question. So to that extent, I've written a book called One Up. I have the Substack that you pointed out. So for me, the curiosity is always to have conversations with a wide range of people and sort of see what's the driver of change, what does the new horizon look like. And to your point, I think blockchain has been sort of taking at least not so much the world by storm as it has been sort of the one thing that we have to go through it now. We can't go around it so much anymore. And it's a fascinating conversation. I think it's a huge vacuum of knowledge. There's very little known. And you mentioned earlier that you started looking at this about 2018. That was right around the same time when I had my first student write a paper on blockchain gaming, and it was really from the angle of, well, how do you apply this technology to game mechanics? So that's kind of where I come in. It's like I live between things. I really enjoy hearing opposing perspectives, and so often do I like to play the role of like, well, I don't know, right? So let's go find out before we assume anything.
Cool. No, I not quite the same level of you, but have a sort of similar trajectory of approaching. I really like data and like business and play games, and I think the sort of combination of those is an interesting perspective to have on things, which is kind of why I really got into blockchain. Because blockchain, obviously one of the elements of it is all the data pretty much is transparent and on an open ledger system for certainly things like Ethereum, and you have all this data floating around kind of all the time. But maybe we'll get into that a bit later. So. It sounds like your first, you're a student in 2018, write a paper about blockchain. I don't quite know kind of what that would have been about then, but from your sort of perspective, when is sort of blockchain something that you sort of fits into that sort of curiosity space for you? I mean, when did you first start to do more than just sort of read around the subject?
For me, it was, I guess, around 2018, 2019. So, I've always had this insane fortune where things just kind of work out that way, and so I guess the full deal goes as follows. So back in 2010, that was getting into digital good measurement and virtual items and microtransactions at the time it was crazy. Nobody believed it. We talked to publishers and they go, well, that's not a big part of my business, why should I care? And to make that understandable and meaningful, I would deal with a few of my friends, sort of figure out like what's the precursor to this, right? So microtransactions were never just built from they didn't originate in some vacuum. So the layup was really, well, it's trading card games, collectible card games. I was a big fan of Warhammer 40K. I played a lot of Blood Bowl in the day, and so I sort of intuitively understood like, well, you buy little bits and pieces of things and build a collection, and then of course even a more rudimentary form of that is like Pokemon trading card games or Magic the Gathering. And so that for me was always the precursor to this. And so digital goods then very quickly kind of fit into that same idea. Blockchain sits in a similar space for me, where you sort of extend this ability for players to own things. And I think it's 10 years ago we had the conversation about like, why would people just have a full game downloaded to their hard drive? What if you lose your hard drive? And that narrative persists all the way to, well, if Google discontinues Stadia, I'm fucked. I lose everything. Like it's sort of there's still this hesitance around digital assets are worthless, or they're effervescent, or you lose them quickly. That we put this sort of belief in these hardware formats and these tangible goods, and so I think blockchain comes sort of as a next iteration in a much broader, much longer wave of how people change their consumer behavior, like consumptive behavior, I should say. And it ends up being, counterintuitive probably for like the resident media executives today, saying, well, why would you want that? The same people that will sell you worthless merchandise with stickers on it and logos on it, saying like, well, now that hoodie is worth $100 because it has your favorite artist's face sort of on it, right? And it's not a quality thing. It's really about that signal to the fan base. I think with digital assets, if I can co-own or own a piece of, or can digitally trade assets that are near and dear to me, that whose narrative economy I enjoy. I've been playing this for a long time. I think that's a very powerful unlock for creativity, for game designers, but also for storytellers and other creative industries. And I think that's an underestimation, that people wouldn't want that. I think there's some challenges to all of this being a huge success just yet, but I think it's a very obvious, very organic next step in what has been an evolution into digital and online culture.
Mm-hmm. And you could be, or being me, I'd be a bit more forceful about that and sort of say that the sort of the problem with the previous step that you say, going on to these digital goods, has been as everything's sort of gone digital and you've not owned anything at all, and every year you're expected to buy a new FIFA or and obviously we see with people selling, obviously World of Warcraft Gold back in the day, or Diablo, or people selling Fortnite accounts now. That I've always felt that despite all the technical issues around blockchain that we still have plenty of to be solved, but sort of the fundamental concept is that players sort of think they sort of, even if they don't sort of legally know, even if they know legally they don't own their stuff now, they morally feel like they should do, because I paid $100 into that game. Why shouldn't I have something sort of tangible that I could sell for $100 or $50 or whatever? So I sort of think see blockchain as actually the fulfillment of this sort of 10-year period in which people have just sort of put money into the slot machine, and obviously had lots of enjoyment. It's not to say that people aren't prepared to pay for it for entertainment, but the ability to actually own something that then can be traded is really a sort of, I think, a fulfillment of that. And I guess when I get a bit carried away with the disruption I think blockchain is bringing, it's because I think suddenly you have the ability to own and trade and pass assets on. I think very quickly now people who start getting into the NFT kind of collectible side of things, very quickly you sort of realise this is going to be around for 10 years, 50 years. How am I going to give this to my children? It's quite a weird sort of kind of mindset that you sort of suddenly take on, and maybe we're all down the rabbit hole anyway, so we're a bit our brains are a bit fried. But people have been playing World of Warcraft for how many years now? Kind of 20 years. Why wouldn't that be something that they can properly own and potentially pass on? Or I think blockchain opens up a lot of that sort of stuff that has just been technically not been able to be done. It's not. There are business reasons why Blizzard hasn't done that as well, but I think a lot of that is due to the technical reasons.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for me, technology is always sort of just whatever, temporary, right? It's like it was incredibly difficult to get 1,000 songs in my pocket, as Steve Jobs would say, and I was like, oh my god, it's so innovative. And now they will give you devices that will play music that carry 1 million songs in your pocket. Like they will give it to you with a box of cornflakes. So the things that seem impossible now are going to be mundane soon enough. I think it's the larger narrative for me has a lot to do with how people relate and express themselves, right? And so it's really, I grew up in a household where my dad would collect music, so he had all these LPs, and he had these old Rin Tin Tin, or these Tintin, that little French journalist. I know him as Kuifje in Dutch. Anyways. So he would have these old hardcover comic books worth, I don't know, something, but it was more like that was his childhood, and that was represented it. And I think to some degree this sort of backward-looking nostalgia feeling is cool. I personally don't have it so much. Like occasionally I'll boot up an emulator and play some Super Mario. I was like, yeah, that was then. That didn't age with me. Although Breath of the Wild is exactly the exception to that rule. But anyways, so digital assets, like physical assets, they are things with which we have meaningful emotional connections. And that, whether that's community-based because it's a cool bunch of people that you see in the case of, you mentioned World of Warcraft, the same is of course the case with the EVE Online, very distinct online communities of people that play together, that have these deep social, interactions, that they betray each other, they befriend each other, it's a whole thing. So I think that's really where the glue is for me, and not so much the technology. And it's the meaningful experiences. And so then, and so I should probably give you some of my disclosures. But so I'm, among other things, I'm an advisor to a company called Interpop, where I work with the creative team and say, like, okay, how do you build some of this stuff? And they have one foot in the comic book business, for instance, which allows you to then, as a user, to sort of vote on, well, which character are we going to feature next? What's the it's not choose your own adventure. It's sort of collectively choose your own adventure. Sort of vote as you go, but it gives people a sense of ownership. And then, of course, the creative team goes to work. What excites me about that is that it's much more of a dialogue between the creative team and the consumptive, audience, and not so much, Moses coming down the mountain saying, like, here it is, I've made this movie and you're going to be in awe of it. It's like, well, sure enough. But, so I think creativity in that sense, if you look at it historically, if you go back 1,000 years, creativity and communicative exchange was very much a shared effort, right? It's an oral culture. It was like you and me reciting poetry, and then we'd arrive at some like new retelling of the same story, and that's how we would pass it on and so on, right? The very notion of meter was just so that it was a mnemonic device, like that's allowed you to more easily remember these key phrases of the story so that you could pass it on to the next generation. That's oral culture. Then it became all sort of put it into little boxes by way of printing press and copyright around music and film. And so we got really into the habit of like purchasing an item, and that item was owned by someone else, but I could use it for the duration of whatever this physical item does, like an 8-deck cassette tape or a CD or whatever. And then technology starts to gnaw away. It's like, well, it wants to be free. It wants to be more easily carried around and distributed. At that point, it becomes digital. Of course, the owners don't like it so much, but the consumers love it, right? Streaming is what saved the music industry over the last few years. And it wasn't because the music industry was initially in on that. They were pushing the brake hard on that technology, as they have consistently done. So the games industry, in my mind, is one of those forward-thinking industries where they embrace it, right? Long before digital distribution in any other creative category was a thing, we already had Valve building Steam. This is 2004. This is way before it was cool. So, for my part of it is the games industry and the people that think creatively, not just about experience, but also about distribution model and what the new technologies afford them to build. That's where a lot of the action is, rather than finding a copy and paste, like a new way to monetize an existing asset. And you are better off just going with what people do. And you see younger generations, like they have no problem spending money, and they are very affluent. That's not the problem. It's really about this market inefficiency of providing and offering them something in a way that makes sense to them. And I think digital ownership is one of them.
So, sort of coming more to sort of individual sort of products, and you've been writing recently about these big sort of funding rounds we're seeing from people like SoRare and Axie or Sky Mavis, funding behind Axie and things like that. So you've been in the sort of the just the traditional game space, I guess we can call it, for a while. Do you just see this as sort of similar to whenever a new sort of sector opens up? Kind of VCs are really into it because they know while there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to win out, that's also the biggest opportunity for them. Do you see? Is it different this time? Like everyone probably always wants to say it's different this time, or is it just sort of, we saw this to a degree with sort of VR maybe 5 years ago, sort of with mobile kind of 10 years ago. I mean, do you see this as substantially different, or is this just this is what we expect when we have a new sort of cycle coming in?
That's a really good one. So, what's the best answer here? I'm going to go with different, although it has similarities to previous cycles, right? So from the console to the PC to mobile, you see this constant resurgence as it adapts, as it builds a new audience, as it reaches, like mobile reached and connected with a very different audience than the console ever did. So for that reason, it didn't so much change a lot of things. It's just it added to the pie, so to say. And for that reason, I think blockchain and the Axies of the world, I think they are inclusive in that, right? They add a whole new audience to it. What's different, I think, is that the logic, the underlying, the economic underpinnings are different. So by which I really mean that blockchain gaming is sort of this precursor to sort of what I understand to be Web3, where it's not large corporations that own your data and then you get to use their service for free. Is that you are an individual agent, an anonymized, singular person on the internet, and you get to decide what data goes where. All right, so you basically walk around with all your NFTs under your arm, and maybe you buy something here, maybe you buy something there, you spend some, and you have your wallet of cryptocurrencies. That is the profile of a consumer, as opposed to I have to make a single account for each of these shitty services, so that then maybe one day I get access to something for free. So it flips the model on its head, in other words. And I think that gaming has always been sort of the canary in the coal mine. Now nobody asks any questions about digital distribution, but that was for a long time was a big thing. Streaming nobody got that. But back in 2000, before I remember 99, 98, it would all be sort of, I guess, quasi-legal or wildly illegal, but you'd have people using their T1 connection at the office to like seed and leech all kinds of content to each other, right? And so it just became commercialized. Like for me, the App Store, to make it more recent, the App Store in many ways is a wonderful invention and it's really well executed. But before that, I would use shareware and freeware. There would be sites like Version Tracker. I don't know if you've ever engaged with those, but so basically it was just, if I could just make my calendar do this one little thing, whatever, and then you just look around and someone had built that, lo and behold, and then you could either donate some money or just use it for free. But so all these little improvements and all these little applications that that Apple wasn't releasing, that existed in this sort of like weird space, and then the App Store kind of commercialized that whole effort. So I think what we're going to see with all of this is that it's going to be sort of an organization and a commercialization of basically property rights and ownership rights of the individual, which I think is a really effective, is a worthwhile cause, to say so. Right. To bring it back to Axie, I think I've watched it with some degree of skepticism, but I think it's wonderful that you have all these people that are playing Axie instead of, basically having to do much more strenuous labor. During a pandemic, when taxi drivers can't really make a living, they play Axie instead, and they make the same amount or similar to or a little bit more. I think that's a very promising first step towards that. It gives you a sense of the scale of the audience that's out there to look at.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in some of your answers there, you said sort of games industry is generally sort of quite forward thinking about adopting technology, but equally there's sort of probably some skepticism about whether the sort of the incumbents in the current cycle, how open they are to adopting something new. And I guess we saw that a little bit with free-to-play mobile, which was for me not such a big jump in terms of the type of game that was being created and distributed. Although there obviously were some pretty big sort of shifts. We didn't really see EA totally failed really in many respects. Activision had to buy or bought King, decided to buy King for whatever it was, $5 billion. So this time round, do you see that the sort of incumbents are going to sort of learn from those mistakes and be sort of nimbler into this new technology and sort of embrace it, or is this going to be a sort of a different case in the sense that blockchain, I guess from a legal perspective, has many more sort of issues around it, I suppose, particularly in the US. So this is actually much more an opportunity for sort of incumbency to be shaken up. So maybe it's Sky Mavis, maybe it's So Rare, maybe some of these companies now coming to the fore with these very big funding rounds at least, and the opportunity to grow quite big products in the next year or so that could suddenly sort of leapfrog some of the companies that have been around for 20 years, at least in terms of kind of a market cap and those sort of things.
So if the question is, are the incumbents going to not make the mistake they've made in the past? And the answer is no, they're going to just do the same thing. And it's purely on the basis that it's not that they don't want to, but it's not that senior management at like an Activision doesn't read or doesn't know things. They have budgets. I mean, these are the type of companies I've advised for years, and so it's just really that they are not set up to benefit from this, right? And so if you look at the best antecedent is mobile. We forget so easily that Tencent a decade or so ago didn't exist, and today it's the largest international games publisher in the world. It's like, all right, it's like, what happened? So what happened was, all these major publishers that are driven around risk mitigation and cultivating an IP portfolio, but always maximizing for return, always weighing 6 different projects against each other, right? You see with Take-Two, like every earnings quarter, every quarterly call, they will say, we have 93 titles under development in our private division, and as if to say that they're going to launch 93 all at once. No, of course not. It's basically battle royale for all these studios, and so that's how they innovate. They acquire small fries and then they build it over time, and that's the Take-Two method. EA, that's a whole can of worms. But let's just agree. It's like they don't exactly have the strongest track record of acquiring innovation. They acquire quite a bit of it, but they've never quite been able to then have it permeate throughout their organization, which is too bad. I really miss Westwood, personally, for instance. In fact, my entire dissertation was written on Command & Conquer. So it's like, it's too bad. Sorry that you killed it. So, but that has everything to do with the risk-averse nature of these organizations. So when something like a mobile phone comes out, or a smartphone comes out, I spoke to Ubisoft. I said, well, why aren't you first in line? It's like, well, we stand to lose the most too, right? If we go and it's a dud, then that it devalues our IP and blah, blah, blah. And so they're just beholden to a different beat, whereas a startup or a privately held company, let's say Wargaming or an Axie, these companies that have really no lords and masters in that sense, financially at least, they can do whatever they want. They can pursue a creative vision all the way down the runway, and I think that puts them in an incredibly valuable position. So when you say incumbents, though, we're talking really about legacy game companies. Like I think the digital and the mobile ones, the mobile first ones, are a little bit more capable, like the Zyngas and FunPlus. Like there, you see really smart acquisitions across the board, and of course, everybody's very wealthy and flush with cash, so it's frantic in that sense. But it's really, so you have the legacy ones, and then you have the digital generation, and then I guess like the blockchain will be the next one, and so. I don't know who's going to lead it there just yet. I think it's going to be a lot of startups. I think it probably is going to be the heavyweight. The gravity point will come from Asia more than anything else, in my mind. But it's not in the nature of these large existing billion-dollar companies to jump on this and do well right away.
Absolutely. In terms of actual kind of products, is there anything that sort of kind of caught your eye? You sort of playing around with this sort of stuff. I imagine you haven't got vast amounts of time to throw around. So,
time is always against us. It's I do like a few of them. And I've taken this my own perspective, having spent so much time in gaming. I realized that a conversation and an analytical perspective on games in isolation from everything else is short-sighted, and so I've been focused. Fanning out a little bit more also on music and art and these other sort of NFT happy categories. So what stands out to me, I like Axie for its first mover advantage. I think that's a no-brainer. At the same time, I have a lot of problems with like how expensive it is. Right, it's like $400 or $500 just to get into the game. You need to have 3 of these things, and then you deploy them all, and then you got to play, spend a bunch of time on it, and then like breed them again, and then. I'm already tired. And it goes very counter to what has, for the last decade, invited so many people into the games, to become gamers and become part of the market, is that it was so accessible. It was free to play. League of Legends runs on whatever Dell laptop you have left from the 90s, So it's low hardware specs, low entry barriers. That's really been a big driver of adoption and expansion. And then in the case of an Axie, you see sort of the opposite, right? Like, okay, how does that go? So I like that one, and I think they've sort of, they are probably the strongest contender to become the Angry Birds of blockchain. Like, what's the application that's going to make everybody kind of get and understand what's going on here? But at the same time, I think it's also very limited still, right? And so I like Illuvium for its higher production values. I forget now the name of it. Phantom Galaxies, is that the one? This sort of mech shooter. That one looks awesome. And it looks exactly like some of the designs I've seen over the years, that weren't sustainable and free to play, because you'd have to build so much and it would be technically so demanding that it just sort of, people forget, I think, that free to play has sort of this technical ceiling to it. Like you can't really make the most amazing thing because it's just not economically sustainable, right? But in a blockchain universe, you can, because people are paying for it, and so then you already establish a revenue income flow that helps you pay for some of it. So that's where I do see some innovation, where you have like an idea that didn't work before that would work now in this new context. And so I have many reservations around all of this. But I like the initial approach, right? I think So Rare has done a pretty good job too. It's like they basically, like, if EA doesn't buy them, then they're stupid, But it's like EA can't afford them soon enough. Like, what they raised at a $3 billion, $4 billion valuation. So good luck, You could probably afford a $1 billion company like you did with Codemasters, but EA is totally washed because what are they going to do? So I like all the design and I like the game mechanics. It's not super innovative just yet. Like, we haven't really truly seen what blockchain can do in that sense. Like, it's basically you sort of transpose existing game mechanics in a blockchain environment and then give people ownership and start all that. But it's a good first generation. Absolutely, it thrives and it's very creative.
Yeah, I often say when I'm sort of talking to game designers, and I think it's interesting that they sort of come at it often, and they as they get more involved, they see more of the sort of features you can do with blockchain, and we've not mentioned anything like DAOs or these sort of interesting governance models you can have. I mean, I think those are sort of ways off for games, but lots of stuff there. But as they get more into it, their game design becomes this enormous bloat of like loads of blockchain sort of elements, and you kind of go. My view sort of at the moment is just allow people to own NFTs and trade them on a marketplace, and that's like 80% of your of the good stuff, kind of right there, because we've never really had that in a legal kind of environment, and just collecting stuff, as we've seen from some of the NFT projects, is the human brain just seems to be quite keen on collecting stuff, and if you say there's a set, you've got to collect all 10 of them, then even if it's sort of meaningless sort of meta, then we go, well, I've got 9 of them, I've got to go and buy the other one to get the 10th one. It's just that sort of tidying up sort of mindset. So I think there's quite a lot of low hanging fruit there, just with people owning NFTs. And I think, as you say, that Phantom Galaxies game, from what I can tell, is just owning super cool mechs and flying around shooting stuff.
Absolutely. And the game mechanics has to be good. Like, it has to be a fun experience, but then also the collectability of things is a key piece, right? It's and for me, it goes back to customizing my little, Space Marines. Like, it's like, well, it's like, this is the standard one, but I kind of use a slightly different color blue, or I have this little vignette over here. And so customization is always been key to any meaningful game experience, I think, to the degree of custom chessboards or, Dungeons and Dragons. The whole point of character creation is that I now establish a emotional connection to this, pencil and paper avatar, but it's emotional that I carry this person through all these scenarios, and then they gain and they lose something, whatever, and that makes me come back to the table, and it keeps me playing with my friends, and so that emotional connection is sort of like the driving engine behind the D&D experience in many ways, and so that's not different in a digital setting. That's just how people are wired. They want to. Every semester, I have a bunch of students who basically confess. It's like, well, I was up late last night because I spent, I had to complete this set in Grand Theft Auto. I had to find all the hidden items. So I had to, collect all the special cars. And so it's just in human nature to want to relate to things in that manner. And I think digital allows people to do that. Even if others, but in a way that's not necessarily competitive, right? Like conventional art and watches and paintings, that's like, well, there's only one Mona Lisa. It's like, see, but we can all have it, but I have a special relationship without, eating into yours, right? We can both benefit from this in our own way. And I think that's somewhat of a radical idea in a world that's, really focused on ownership, assetization, on copyright law and so on. I think that's a new wave.
Are you seeing more sort of interest in this sort of stuff with your students? Because I guess you are sitting in that nice inter kind of section of business and games. I mean, are your students interested in blockchain, or is it sort of not?
It's coming more now. Like, so there's always a few. So for me, the teaching gig is really, it's a lot of fun. So I do it one day a week, and it's basically my dojo where I'm sure you know this, but when you go into a big boardroom and a bunch of executives, like, nobody's trying to show you their hand, right? It's a big sort of collective game of poker, and it's like you're just sort of the only one sharing, and that's what they pay you for, and that's sort of it. The classroom setting is opposite. They will tell me everything they're so excited to share. It's like, oh, professor, I just did this. Like, I'm not actually a full professor, but whatever. That's what they refer to me to. And so they end up, enlightening by accident everybody else. And so because it's NYU and perhaps because it's a business school, so there's a huge array of international students. And it's fascinating. So, I've written about MapleStory and Nexon and all these companies over the years. And then, of course, here is now a kid that grew up with that stuff. Like, he was playing it when he was 7, and so many years later, he's in my classroom. I was like, well, tell me, like, what was the big deal, right, when you were that age? And so you get, in that moment, you get so much depth and color on what the relationship between people and games really is. And so when it comes to blockchain, the ones that have really taken to it are sort of interested in one or two things. One of them is they're really hardcore card game players. They sort of see the light instantly, like, well, hey, you know what? I already have this Magic the Gathering collection. I'd love to have a digital version of that. I'd love to be able to trade on that. Like, imagine a system of arbitrage on trading card games where, as I play the game, I hold certain cards because I have a good hunch that when the next edition, the next release comes out, the value, the utility value, or the aesthetic value of this card will become increasingly rare and therefore more valuable, and I can trade on that, right? And so that's really a big part of what trading card gamers do in my classroom. Also the ones that, and EVE Online, I mentioned before, but EVE Online, they would have a quarterly report on the mineral trade. And so people that, I know hedge fund managers, and so to relax, they go sit in their den and they have 4 screens and they trade minerals in EVE Online. That's what they do for fun. So that mindset totally gets blockchain. So that's one. And then there's the ones that really like the finances of it, right? So of course it's a big hype. Okay, how do you make this work? So how do you pitch something? How do you build it? And in their case, I try to remind them that, for all of this to work, the games have to not suck, right? And I think it's to the credit of like an Angry Birds, for instance, in the mobile context, they did really well because they grinded it out in terms of marketing. They really they walk the walk, so to say. At the same time, the game is fun. I don't like it so much anymore, but at the time when it came out, it was so fun to shoot a bunch of birds at pigs. You see, like, this is just insane, this asinine gameplay is good, but it's so fun. But intuitively, it told you everything you need to know about your new iPhone, right? And so I think that's the nexus that we're going at, and that's what students, they have lots of time and money to kind of mess around with that, and so that's where I get some of these ideas too.
Okay, so a final question. I've thrown this sort of, the statement I'm going to say, I've thrown it around sort of quite a bit without thinking about it too much. So as someone who actually has been professionally giving numbers about the games industry, I'm just interested in your take on it. So if we say the games industry now is whatever it is, $200 billion a year, depending on exactly how you measure it. And I've always said blockchain will take the games industry from whatever it is, $200 billion a year into a $1 trillion trading volume. So obviously two different things here, because the $200 billion is going from consumers to game makers. That's a sort of a one-way sort of street. The 1 billion a year trading volume is obviously, stuff's being recycled over and over again. So actually maybe that's only sort of five times the volume. But do you think that's a sort of a good statement? Does that tell us anything, or is that just sort of like, I should think of a better sort of financial meme than that. I guess it's the billions to trillions. I guess I'm trying to sort of
right.
Like
when did we get to $1 trillion? I share with you the optimism. I don't. I tend to shew the round numbers a little bit because they, it's like when people say like, oh, the industry's going to be 213 billion. They go like, oh, that's interesting. And say, no, for the first time ever, it broke 200 billion. It's like, oh, that's now it's even though the number is smaller, but round numbers tend to have a different impact. So, a $1 trillion business, we're not quite there yet by a stretch, but I think something like blockchain is right now meaningless, to be honest. Like they make money, but so much of that is venture capital sort of propping it up, and so much of it is just shitty design and poorly executed drops and all this stuff. So it's lurching forward, but by no means is it a Ferrari, right? And so we're not quite there yet. Whereas mobile right now, or console and PC, there are like these fine-tuned industries. So let's say we double it. Can we double the games industry in the next 5 years? I think so. And blockchain will be part of that. Absolutely. It's depending on the swiftness of the adoption on the supply side, like particularly the incumbents, and of course the consumer base, and whether or not somebody comes up and solves these problems. Because right now it's way too fragmented. So all we see is headlines about high valuations and lots of money, but the industry, the blockchain gaming industry, is starving right now, and it's starving for talent. This technology jumped forward, but there's no people to go with it, right? So when mobile first came out, what you had was people that had been in the feature phone business, which is a shitty business, by the way, but so that business existed already. So you had people making mobile games. And you also had a financial crisis in 2008. So you had a lot of people, like, you imagine like designers and so on, they got laid off first. So they start tinkering in their kitchen. So that was really what became that first generation of mobile app makers and mobile game makers. And then you had some of these spin-off people from like a Supercell and a Rovio. So in blockchain, you don't have any of that. Right? They're like, where are these people? Like, who are these people making this? Well, they haven't been hired yet. And so every conversation I have is, hey, do you know anyone who could jump in and help with this? Because we're fresh out of humans. And so there's just like it's going to take a little while for staffing to ramp up for all these companies. And so they're at a labor shortage, so to say, and that might very well turn off in the next year or so consumer demand, because they're going to, well, everything's broken here. Why would I want this? I'm not spending money here. So that's where I think we have a lot of ways to go with it. But yes, I absolutely expect it to contribute to the games industry's prolonged
Good. You poured cold water on my somewhat overheated expectations, which is
look,
there's a burn up in the room finally.
It's the thing to remember is like we both sort of latched a little wagon to like this giant thing that just went apeshit. Like I started the games industry, it was worth like 20-30 billion. So it's easy for me to say like, oh, what you should do is like this, because it's been doubling every year. I remember, it kind of, when you have this much wind in your sails, it's easy. Like I think it's always, so I'm always curious about like what's going to go south. And perhaps that's my Dutch self, but I end up sort of like, well, what's the thing that's going to break first? And there's no talent for one. There's all this money that basically leads to all these inflated expectations. Who's going to, are they all going to be like? So you see, for instance, venture capital funding a lot of projects, started by people that used to be in some VP or whatever role at some publisher. It's like, is that the next generation? Are those the next generation people? Is that really going to be the big idea? Like these sort of former office workers with a budget. Like so I'm very skeptical to kind of not to dismiss anybody in particular, but just sort of say like, you can't all succeed here. This is like, most of this is going to just be like most of the bands out there playing shitty music, and most of the crappy movie makers on YouTube. Like it's going to be mediocre as hell. Except you have $20 million to do it with, and so you're going to see this $20 million mediocrity. I think that we're going to go through those phases, and that's just normal.
No, I absolutely agree that there's going to be. I mean, I'd actually be quite harsh on that sort of side. I'd probably say like 99% of projects are going to be horrible embarrassment, not fulfill anything like they And I think a lot of that is as you say, is to do with the inexperience of the teams. They've never built a product before, never had a team. That there's no experience in there. I don't think they're scamming people. I think they're in the best will in the world. They think they can make a AAA game with 10 people in 6 months, because they've never made a triple C game. So, anyway, exactly, absolutely. Thank you very much, Juice. That was great. We've gone into covered a lot of stuff there, and I think we've it's been a very sort of I've enjoyed it. It's been a very different tone to normally the triumphant sort of stuff that we've had. But I think a dose of good Dutch skepticism is appropriate.
I'm always a fan. And I think it's the game industry has been such a source of like just pure enjoy. I love working in the industry, and so it naturally, like, I like to keep it to a high standard, whether that's data and research and analytics, or whether that's creativity and sort of all the exuberance that you see. Okay, let's find out. Let's go build it. But everybody's got a great idea until they get punched in the mouth, right? And so it's like, and you design great games because of it. Anyways, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation as well, as you can tell.
Lovely. Thank you, Juice. You can find Juiced on Twitter, and I recommend you sign up for his Substack, SuperJoost, JOOST. And thanks for watching and listening to this one. We are going to be up next week for number 100. Got something interesting planned there, so please do subscribe to the channel via YouTube or your podcast provider of choice. But thanks for listening, and see you next time.